Oh. So welcome everyone. It's good to see so many faces and folks are joining. Vivekji won't be able to join us today. He's actually in Varanasi with a group of seekers. So understandably, he won't be joining us tonight. So I have the great fortune of welcoming everyone to actually our first mentorship, our first wellness workshop of the year. And for those who are new to this forum, we hold monthly workshops as part of our mentorship Sangha or our mentorship program. And if you're not already part of the mentorship Sangha and you want to learn more, I'll put in the chat in a little bit more information about the program. Please do sign up, learn more about it at the website. We'd love to have you join the group. What's really cool about this workshop series, this wellness workshop series, is it's actually run by our community. So we partner with seekers who are leaders in their field. They deeply know a topic, and they're really passionate about connecting their work to Vedanta, both the sacred and the secular. And in the past, we've covered topics like caring for aging parents, managing anxiety, developing self-compassion. So a lot of topics that many of us are thinking about, maybe struggling with, or looking to discuss with others. And so this year we're lining up a great set of topics as well, and we'll continue to have this monthly series as part of the Mentorship Sangha. Tonight, we're very excited to have Nina Bhattacharya leading our session. So Nina, I'm going to share a little bit about Nina. I'm excited. She's a friend of mine, and she's such a wonderful figure in so many of our communities. So Nina is a seeker and sevika who's been serving the mission for many, many years in Michigan and in Boston and many other regions. And if you know Nina, she's extremely thoughtful. She's a very lovely person to be around. And it's really cool to see her journey with a lot of focus and dedication. She's really tuned her work to serving others. And a little bit of bio on Nina. She's an instructional designer at Harvard University and current clinical social world student at Boston College. And she has rooted in her background in global health and higher education. And Nina designs learning experiences that nurture and amplify the agency, well-being, and creative power of young people, particularly queer and trans youth. And so we're really excited for Nina to be addressing us on the topic of nurturing communities of care. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nina. And just for everyone on the line, Nina requested, and usually on our call, we just request that you keep your video on so we can see your face and engage with you. And I'll hand it over to Nina.
Thank you, Pooja. Hari Om, everyone. It is a delight to be back with the Mentorship Sangha for a wellness workshop. It is such a cool offering that we have from Chinmay Mission Niagara, where we can come together and learn from each other on a variety of topics, grounded in this shared experience of Vedanta, but looking at the world around us. So I'm pumped to be sharing space with all of you. I had the most amazing and awkward experience of watching my wellness workshop from 2 years ago in preparation for this. So if you were there then, I'm going to be just as bombastic and enthusiastic as then, except with shorter hair but the same Zoom background. So really excited to be here with each and every one of you. And I'm just going to take a minute to share my screen. There we go. Okay, can we see things, Pooja? I'm just going to glance at, awesome. I got a thumbs up. That's great. That's what we're looking for. And yes, as Pooja shared, my name is Nina. I use she, her pronouns. And if you're joining right now, take a minute to rename yourself to include your pronouns. As Pooja shared, my background is in global health and higher education. I thought I was going along the line of studying public health, but in studying public health, I really landed on research focusing on queer and trans youth and their relationships with their parents. And 2 years ago, when I last joined all of you in this kind of forum, I had just been accepted into social work school. And here we are 2 years later. I'm in a clinical social work student. And as a part of this program, I get to work really deeply with queer and trans youth. And this means so much to me. One, as a queer South Asian person myself, but two, like it really feels like I'm oriented in the right direction. So that's my personal update, to just be like, yes, we can make changes and pivots and it can feel really, really good. Cool. Some grounding thoughts as we are here, same as before. We will be open because we don't always know things, and that's totally fine. Some of this we might be hearing for the 50th time. Some of this we might be hearing for the very first time. We will be curious because, as any seeker is, we're guided by a sense of exploration. And that also applies to topics like gender and sexuality. And we'll embrace making mistakes because, you know, it's hard to try something and maybe mess up. People's feelings can be hurt. There can be harm. Those are all such real things. But we are currently here right now in a learning space. So this is an environment where we'll embrace the fact that, hey, we're not going to get it right all the time. And that's not always okay, but we're going to give each other a little bit of grace. We're going to be gentle with ourselves. And so another way to share this is you do your own self-care. If like we're talking about sensitive things that like surface something that's kind of hot and bubbly for you and you need to take a breather, you do that. I have you on gallery mode, but I'm not monitoring whether or not you're on the screen. I trust you to take care of yourself in the way that you need. And if you're confused in any part of that's totally okay. And it's frankly pretty normal. I'm also confused about some of this too, as I continue both reflecting on myself and like also engaging with young people. Okay. Yes. Here's a beautiful intersection of blobs. What do we think that they mean? In the chat, I would love to hear, like, when you see this, what are you reflecting on? What could this be? I'm going to like look at some of our seekers to be like, yes, type some stuff. What does this evoke for you? Connection, intersectionality. Yes. Sumedha Anjali says identity, church windows. Ananya says abstract, commonalities, unity and diversity. I see a whole range of options, and I love that a lot of them are getting at where we come together, where we intersect. Gender and sexuality are two of a bajillion different identities many of us hold. Some of us are coming from a South Asian background. Some of us are immigrants. Some of us were born in the United States. Some of us are of a higher socioeconomic status. Some of us went to college. Some of us live in New England. Some of us don't. You know, these are all different types of identities that we have that kind of intersect in our own specific way. So I just want us to hold that we're looking at a tiny piece of something that is much, much bigger than just gender and sexuality. And when we come to these topics, we're bringing that whole set of identity with us. And, well, okay, this is a pretty big and colorful image. It's called a gender unicorn. Some of you may have experienced the genderbread person if you've been a part of different workshops, but don't panic at all the color. I'm going to walk through it really briefly. If you want a deeper dive into like the specific terminology around gender and sexuality, go to the Chimera Niagara YouTube channel, and in our wellness workshop playlist from 2021, my session from then does a little more like gender and sexuality 101, but acknowledging that all of us are coming from different backgrounds, language experiences, etc. I'm doing like a really tiny brief overview of gender and sexuality. And something to just hold is that it's really complex. There's a lot of different factors. There's gender identity, which is how I see myself, whether it is man, woman, bigender, agender. There's a non-binary. The second is gender expression, and that's how I show myself into the world. So I would say today I'm presenting more feminine, but for other days, I do sometimes, maybe I'm wearing a suit and I'm feeling more masc in my expression. Something to keep in mind is what my identity is and how I express in the world. Sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. And sometimes that can be confusing for people when they perceive me, but that's okay. We're just going to sit with that. These are two separate things. Then there's the sex assigned at birth. And so I was assigned female at birth. So sometimes in the community, you might see something called AFAB, AFAB, which means assigned female at birth. But acknowledging that when each person is born, a clinician assigns a specific sex. That is not reflective of necessarily how I feel in my body or even how I present myself in the world. This is a specific kind of designation. And most interestingly, and I will admit this is an area where I'm like growing a lot more of my knowledge, is that there is a difference in who I might be physically attracted to and who I'm emotionally attracted to. So some of us have heard the phrase asexual. That might be that is referring to physical attraction. And some people may use the word aromantic or demi-romantic. Don't ask me to define all of these things right now, but that is mostly referring to around emotional attraction, acknowledging that these things we assume to be interlinked in the same, but can be disaggregated and not necessarily so. Okay, so I'm going to take a deep breath. We have gender identity. That's like how I see myself. There's gender expression, which is how I present myself into the world. There's sex assigned at birth, which again, may not at all relate to my gender identity or expression. There's who I'm physically attracted to. And then there's folks who I'm emotionally attracted to. And this kind of like messy blob, this intersection, this rainbow is like, that is Nina, that is Rachna, that is Pooja. We all have our different gender unicorn. So in some classrooms, kiddos might spend some time diving into this with thinking about their own identity. We're not going to do that here, but it's certainly an exercise that you might find interesting for yourself to be like, okay, where do I fall in this? What language would I use to describe myself? Okay, we have a tiny bit of basis in some language. If you're feeling overwhelmed, again, I just want to affirm that's okay. We're in it together. We're going to breathe through it. We're diving in, but we have enough where we can maybe have some conversations. I also want to add that, like, yes, we have our intersections of all of our identities. We have our own personal gender and sexual identities, and these really manifest in our relationships with ourselves, the family system, and a whole lot of external factors. This is just like a quick snapshot of some of my earlier research that I was mentioning, where I was looking at the relationship of young people and their caregivers, not necessarily parents. It could be grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever they were living with. And what we noticed was there was a lot of, all of these factors matter. All of these factors matter. School, community, workplace, religion, extended family. These are all factors that kind of affect the experience within the family system. And then the experience within the family system, for those of you who are parents, you know this, the learning doesn't go just one way. It's a bi-directional relationship that a caregiver might have with their kiddo. They're learning from you, you're learning from them. And if it's a two caregiver household, there's a lot of learning happening in between parents as well. So that is just, we're going to dig into the social piece because it's really, really important. Now, I'm hoping that we'll have ample time to do 2 activities to think about how we can co-create nurturing communities together. Again, I'm really no expert on this subject. I'm someone who just happens to care a lot and has like a lot of belief that we can do all of this work together. So I may offer something that you can take away with you, but I think you'll find that we're going to be co-creating this together, because the answers in nurturing a community of care comes from the community itself. Okay, I'm going to admit that this is the piece that will feel kind of heavy. And so if you need to like mute or go off screen, we're going to be talking a little bit about the current environment in the United States regarding LGBTQ rights. It's not good. It's actually pretty actively harmful. And I found myself really struggling to put together today's workshop because I was thinking, oh my goodness, like I want this to focus on joy, the joyfulness of being part of a community, about seeing a person as their fullest self. But we can't ignore the context that we're in. And some of the things that have been happening in the last 2 weeks is that more than 150 organizations came together and asked the New York Times to really reconsider how it's reporting on transgender issues. I won't go into full depth, but it also spurred a lot of advocacy from contributors to the New York Times, you know, like really, really lauded journalists, writers who contributed to different facets of the New York Times, saying that, hey, like the way we're talking about trans issues is pretty dehumanizing and actively puts in danger young people who are seeking gender affirming care. Now, the New York Times, the executive editor, unfortunately said that any journalists who are critiquing the New York Times are actively abandoning their journalistic ethics in the sake of advocacy. Now, that's a pretty tricky thing to say, right? And these are comments are happening right before the New York Times published a pretty large piece about J.K. Rowling, who's a noted anti-trans person. So that is in the air. It's like something, a place that we look to for a lot of journalistic integrity is actively saying that, no, we're not contributing to the problem, where in fact, a lot of legislation across the country right now has cited New York Times pieces as justification for their anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and that's pretty unfortunate. Another thing, and this is me with my public health hat on, is states like Tennessee have rejected $9 million from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for HIV/AIDS prevention, because some of that money goes to organizations that work with trans folks, despite having some of the highest rates of HIV/AIDS in the country. So they're actively undoing like years of progress, like public health prevention progress over this specific point. And a lot of folks in public health are really fearful of what that means for folks who are unable to access HIV/AIDS care in a specific state. These are the ramifications we're talking about. It isn't literally just anyone who's LGBTQ. Plenty of people who aren't queer or trans have HIV and AIDS, and this affects them as well, this anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And I just want to underscore, like a lot of people, particularly in New England where I'm at, say that like, oh, that's all of the problem with the South. It's the South that's more conservative. No, that is not true. In 2023 alone, 321 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced. 321 in 2 months. On Valentine's Day, I believe it was like South Dakota that became the latest state to restrict gender affirming care to young people. A lot of states are introducing laws that criminalize drag queens from reading storybooks at libraries. It's a lot. And just to break down what you're seeing here, this graphic from the ACLU, the darker purple represents a greater number of anti-LGBTQ bills, while the lighter shades, meaning fewer bills, have been introduced. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, just because I live in California, or in my case, because I'm in Boston and Massachusetts, that's great, that's cool. We're like super pro LGBTQ. We have not introduced any anti-trans bills. Something to consider is that like there are layers to this. In Massachusetts, for example, comprehensive sexuality education in the state has not been updated in more than a decade and is not inclusive of different sexualities, of different genders. So even though a state may not have an anti-LGBTQ bill introduced into legislation, it doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a welcoming environment. So I just really want to emphasize that, because, and I'm guilty of this too, is thinking like this is only a problem in a part of the country, and that isn't the case. It's a problem that's affecting all of us. And like, this is the heaviest part, and this is me saying as someone who works at like every day with LGBTQ college students at a Jesuit university. This is like, there's an awesome organization called GLSEN. They focus specifically on schools, and every 2 years they do the study on school climates, and specifically middle school and high schools. And almost all LGBTQ students surveyed, over 22,000 folks in the survey, have heard homophobic remarks from classmates and teachers. I want to underscore that. So this is a place where kiddos are spending most of their day, and they're hearing this from the people who are teaching them. And only 1 in 10 LGBTQ students reported their teachers actually intervened when overhearing homophobic remarks. I didn't put this data on the slide, but something to hold and like keep tenderly with us is that among students who are like harassed, bullied, victimized, who are LGBTQ, about like a majority of them did not report it to schools because they didn't think anyone would do anything about it. And that feels like really sad to me. That feels like really, really sad to me, that students do not feel comfortable sharing with a parent or teacher because they don't think anything can change. And this is why I'm like so moved that everyone in this community came together, and we raised over $25,000 to contribute towards the Trevor Project, which is an organization that runs a 24/7 crisis hotline for queer and trans youth, and a community as well. They also do a lot of really excellent research on young people. So I'm like, that's why I'm grateful to be here right now to like share this space with you, because these are things that are not good. They're happening to us. They're happening to people we know. And I'm flashing this on the screen. Feel free to take a screenshot. Maybe you can benefit from it. Maybe someone else in your life can benefit from it. There's the link to the Trevor Project resources. You can call, you can text, which is great. You can also chat. That's really helpful. And I especially want to note that DAKE, which is at the bottom, is specifically designed to support Desi LGBTQ folks. It's a volunteer hotline, and they've done some wonderful work in connecting folks to resources. Okay, now what? I know we've sat in the heaviness of all of the things, but that's okay, because that's sometimes being a person in the world. We sit with the heavy things, but we're here together. We're swimming through it together. I'm overheating a little bit. That's okay. We're doing it. We're going to look at this. Some of you might remember it from a couple years ago, but when I throw this up on the screen, what do you think? I'm going to ask for some chat interaction. What does this evoke for you? What is this diagram? There's actually a couple of different answers. Circles of identity, okay? how your seva should grow. Any other thoughts? Different tiers of belonging, where we can make a difference. Spheres of influence, our world, circles of support. It starts with me, then people around me. Tiers of responsibility. Seema sharing, reminds me of the sheaths and self-unfoldment. Chinmaya shares how you can teach the people who are close to you. Yeah, these are all beautiful insights. Yes, couple of different thoughts. One snapshot. In Vedanta, we talk about like how our seva should grow. We should start by thinking of the individual. Then as we deepen our sadhana and enter different stages of life, we're thinking about the family, we're thinking about the community, and then we're also broadening into society. Interestingly enough, this is the same kind of diagram that you would use in like public health too, to think about social determinants of health, the factors in the air that we breathe, where we walk, where we grow up, where we play, where we learn, that affect our health. We use that same diagram in public health. And also, even more interestingly, in family systems, which is like one of the bajillion theories that exist if you're in the psychology space, we're thinking about how factors from society and community shape the family system and how the individual interacts with that as well. So a lot of different layers, a lot of beautiful answers, and I really appreciate you thinking of that. With that frame, we're here to talk about how do we actually nurture communities of care. And one way that I find helpful for considering all of this is thinking about what types of things might fit under each layer. What are individual actions? What are things I can do at home in my family? What are things I can do in my community, like if that's school or my workplace? And then what are things that are more at the society level? Now you could think of this at the state level in terms of legislation or even beyond that. So we're going to use these 4 circles to do a little bit of collective brainstorming. So cool. I'm just going to I have another breakout room activity that we are going to do later. So I'm not going to ask people to out loud share stuff in this moment. I'm just going to read some of this out loud, but be ready later. You all are going to have to talk. Okay. So individual level, we can do things like being a good listener and being patient, being inclusive. Infinity is all inclusive. We're all part of the same Brahman, Shravanam, Mananam, and Nididhyasanam, and all of that will help us, right? I was just talking to Rachna as everyone was in groups that we're going to Bal Vihar. Some of us are teaching Bal Vihar. Some of us are being made to go to Bal Vihar. It is a lot to ask someone to keep going into a space if it isn't welcoming. So a lot of this, I love these connections to Vedanta itself. Understanding your own gender and sexuality to further help you understand and accept others, right? This isn't an issue that's only for folks who are queer and trans. We all have something to learn about ourselves. Be an ally, staying up to date on current events. Listen to their experiences without judging them or projecting your own view onto them. Use empathy as a tool to decide whether or not you could say something before you say it. A lot of valuable guidance there. Within the family, some actions that were suggested: conversations with older family members. Parents bringing up the idea of identity earlier on. I really appreciate that because a lot of young people, a lot of kids, and I'm saying really young children, have a sensibility around their gender and their sexuality, at least social messages around that, and their own feelings at a pretty young age. So thinking about earlier on through books or other tools is a great idea. being mindful of the type of language we're using in front of kids. Educating family members that may not have that perspective in a gentle way. Yeah, we're well situated to have conversations with a lot of love and heart, and it requires a lot of vulnerability and tenderness, because sometimes those conversations can bring up a lot of tough feelings. But when we're able to be in a space where we can have that conversation, we're really posed well to create a more accepting space. Using our pronouns. Yes, and I just want to name that as like a fun fact. Sometimes people say preferred pronouns. I would encourage us to stop using the phrase preferred pronouns. Just say pronouns. That's what they are. They're not a preference. They are that. Similarly, this is just an observation I had when with my student hat on. A professor asked someone what their pronouns were, and they said she, they. And the professor said, which one do you prefer? Maybe not the best approach in that situation. If someone shares their pronouns are she, they, you should feel comfortable to use either or. So some little pro tips I wanted to share right then and there. What can be clarified? What's bothering you? I love that it's like a question we can ask. Like we can ask questions from each other that evoke curiosity. At a community level, there's university communities that are growing in their EDI work. Yeah, absolutely. Employee resource groups at work that focuses on EDI, a lot more, like workplace insurances are covering different modalities for fertility, that's really supportive, and also gender affirming care. Like that's really supportive of LGBTQ folks. Educating the community on common issues such as lack of inclusive restrooms, bullying language around gender identity, etc. Yeah, some of this is structural. Like, do our Chinmay Mission centers have a bathroom that folks who are non-binary can use comfortably? That's a good question to ask. Maybe yes, maybe no. And maybe what can we do better in that space? Working on breaking down compassion fatigue, supporting the supporters. Yeah, doing this work is hard, especially for people who identify as queer or trans, and also like for folks who are supporting them. It's a lot to fight the fight, quote unquote. It's hard to be an advocate if so many different spaces are less inclusive. So learning how to rely on our communities that are more inclusive to nurture that care so we feel less on the verge of burnout is so, so crucial. And then the societal level, creating and spreading awareness, influencing curriculum. This one's a huge one. A lot of people are influencing curriculum, and I would argue in perhaps not the best way. A lot of books are being banned. What does it mean if we're not being exposed to different types of narratives? Be a policymaker, yes. Whoever wrote that, please run for office. I will happily vote for you. Identifying organizations and supporting them financially, yes. Trevor Project, a great organization, also really, really well funded. Something, if you want to go like next level, is like find a tiny organization in your community or state that's doing this work. That's one way to grow and nurture. Supporting legislation and candidates, influencing the media. Oh, I want to go back to the community one because a thought that I had, we focused on the university and the workplace. Think about your schools. Think about your schools. Ask your kid what's going on in the school, like what teachers are being supported, which ones aren't. Like these are conversations we can have. I love all of this. Okay, we are totally, I'm just letting you know, we are going to have dialogue. It's going to be briefer within this hour session. So if you need to drop off at 10, I totally respect that. But I will be hanging around for at least a half an hour after if you have any questions. We had a really rich and nuanced dialogue the last time we did this, so happy to sit around for that. I'm going to jump back into my slides just to share a little bit more. And I just, again, wanted to thank you for like that very, very tender and like rich engagement with an exercise that could have felt really, really hard. Could have felt really, really hard, or it could have been really, really easy. I love that if it was. Okay. Oh, this is my fun graphic from last time. I want you to like be able to sit with it again. It's a little acronym I called Hopefully that makes it really easy to remember. You know, Vivekji loves his acronyms. I thought I would like maybe take a cue from him. It gives us a way of being in the world. Assess our media, community, and context. Who do you follow on Instagram? What are your news sources? What TV shows do you watch? Like, what are the norms in your group of family friends? These are all places where you can assess. We talk about how our inputs really affect what's happening inside. If your inputs are not very diverse, chances are it's harder to think more expansively about diverse communities. Something to keep in mind. Assess, that's the first A in The second is ask, don't assume. And this is about anything. I should say your first option should be to ask Google. It's a lot to ask someone who is queer or trans to answer a question about being queer or trans. Try to do your homework first, if you can, okay? If you can, not always possible, but if you can. And then if you aren't sure, like, hey, I let's say I don't know Beeple's pronouns, I can be like, hey, Beeple, what are your pronouns? That's awesome. We can have that conversation together. So ask, don't assume, but also like keep in mind where you do your own little seeking first before you ask that question. And then model, that's the M and we can model to the people around us who we love. What are ways we want to be in the world? So it can be anywhere from introducing our friends, saying like, oh, this is my friend. They are absolutely amazing. You know, like showing that I'm using they, them pronouns, for example. These are social cues. Small things like introducing myself, like, hello, I'm Nina. I use she, her pronouns. It doesn't mean when you introduce yourself, you're obligated to share your pronouns, but it does give you the agency to know that like, this is an environment where like, if you do share, like that will be held and you'll be cared for. So that is something to consider. Assess your inputs, then A, ask, and then M, model. Those are just like a few like tactile tips I wanted to share that kind of capture some of like the essence of what all of you were sharing in the small groups.
Before we end, Nina has kindly agreed to stay after to answer any questions. So
that's a beautiful question, Sudarshan, and I really appreciate you asking that because I think it's one that a lot of people share and that sometimes we don't even but we're like too hesitant to say out loud. So thank you. So I would think of this in like two perspectives. There's two frameworks. One is from the framework higher level, right? As Vivekji would say. And the higher level perspective here would be from the perspective of oneness, it's all one. Identities don't matter. Whether it's gender, sexuality, race, etc., religion, socioeconomic status, etc. At the high, like when we're looking at through the lens of oneness, all of it is one. There is no duality, okay? But that is we're not in that context all of the time. In this frame we are right now when, you know, we're thinking of Bhagwan and myself, right? There's still a little bit of duality there. Seeker and what we're seeking. From this frame as people in the world right now, we do have to acknowledge that we are different. And actually, when we're, I would say like some of the qualities of a seeker are to be more sensitive, right? And part of being more sensitive is caring about how people want to be received in this world. Also, another analogy that comes to mind is like, Vivekji talks about how we should relate to the body, that like take care of the body in such a way you don't have to think of the body. So imagine if everyone had just access to the like gender affirming care that they needed, so they wouldn't have to be like in a dysphoric space. Like they could just be themselves, their best selves, being seen and perceived as they wanted to be. Like that would be beautiful and wonderful. So I think there's ways we can take snippets of what we're learning in Vedanta, that as we also like, thoughts are coming as I'm talking out loud. So I appreciate your patience with me. We also, in a lot of our scriptures, talk about we had to be like really in tune with our own personality characteristics. Some of us are more sattvic, some of us are rajasic in these ways, some of us are tamasic in other ways. Like we are literally different people who come into this world with different sets of personality traits and experiences. And we do have to be attuned to these differences in order to be seekers. Like we can't ignore that these things exist. So I just would share that like sensitivity is really important, that we do have to acknowledge difference in a world where differences still exist. And also putting on a social justice hat, I would say that if we truly think everything is one and the world is reflecting inequities or inequalities, it is incumbent on us to ensure that we are actively working to erase those inequalities or inequities in society. So that is another lens. And then of course, the highest lens is everything is one, no identity labels matter. But again, just putting it out there, that is a frame when we're thinking of everything as one. And that's not a frame we're in at all times. I appreciate the question. Someone who's who uses the pronouns she, they could really be of any gender is your short answer. And what I would do in that situation is, how would you address them? They said that they use the pronouns she, they, so use she or they. That's like the beautiful thing about pronouns. They're giving, like, we're given a map of how the person would want to be addressed. But we shouldn't assume necessarily what the gender is. This is a good question, very challenging and very true. Just because of what I wear, it may not be reflective of my gender. And I'm thinking specifically, so every week, like I work one-on-one clinically with queer and trans college students. I also run a weekly discussion group with queer and trans students of color. And one student, she uses she, they pronouns, and we talk a lot about the way she dresses sometimes means the world perceives her like looking like a 12-year-old boy. And that causes a lot of pain and a lot of difficult experiences in her life. What has been helpful is like trusting when someone shares with you. I think Rishi was sharing this earlier, trusting when someone shares with you something that's tender, a tender part of themselves, to just really treat that with care and respect it. And also just don't make assumptions. That's also a really good, helpful thing. Ask the question. Oftentimes I'm like, I'm really sorry, like, what are your pronouns? Can you please remind me your pronouns? And then, yeah, I'm gonna keep that there. Person should have their choice to share their pronouns. And it sounds like your company allowed people the choice of whether or not they wanted to change their badge. And for some people that was really affirming. And for some other people, they didn't want people to know. And that is okay. Both are very, very valid. And so maybe part of it is like acknowledging your colleagues, like in intense feelings and being like, yeah, I can see why, you think that you wouldn't want corporate to know your pronouns. I think sometimes people like to keep their pronouns to themselves, and that's totally okay. Or like, oh, like for me, I'm very comfortable sharing my pronouns. So I just wanted to make sure that that was available for like when I'm meeting clients and other colleagues, because I want to like signal that people can and should feel comfortable with me too, like if I'm in a specific environment. So it can go both ways. I think acknowledging your colleagues, where your colleague might be coming from could be a helpful place to start. And then also affirming why you changed it. Like that could be another helpful direction to at least communicate your perspective. That is very interesting. So if you have any thoughts on self-care about like this kind of fatigue, do drop them in the chat. Some thoughts is that like for folks who are queer and trans, like the education work isn't all on you. Like, I just want to say that. I want to affirm that. You don't have to do all the work by yourself. You shouldn't have to. And if people really do genuinely love you as you are, they'll also be showing up. I think that's important to say. Like, you don't have to do it alone. It's on the rest of us, all of us, to hold each other in intersections. And then also I find it, and I know you do this, but leaning on the things that replenish you, the people who replenish you, the people who see you fully, like we can all identify those humans, you know, who have maybe gone through similar experiences, maybe who haven't gone through similar experiences, but can like hold the space you need to feel seen and to acknowledge that we can't like always be strong and smiley and supportive. And so making spaces where we can just feel the feelings rather than suppressing them. I think that comes up a lot in our like, in their teachings around in Vedanta, like what happens when we suppress all the negative emotions, they all bubble up like a volcano, they explode later, for better or for worse. So creating spaces where we can feel those feels. And in terms of intake of the news, I think for people, I think if you're pretty attuned to the news, I would reduce your intake of the news. Like, I know that sounds like a kind of a backwards thing because earlier we were talking about staying up to date on current events, but if someone is of a particular community, it can be re-traumatizing to intake things like news that is frankly traumatizing, that reinforces all the hurt and pain in the world. So I think you could probably dial back at least 25%, knowing your news intake about, like, be tuned in just enough, or maybe limit the time of day where you're accessing the news. Maybe accessing the news in the first thing in the morning when one is like most like less tired and you have like more of the emotional bandwidth to deal with difficult things, and then limit it. So how often are you checking it? Chances are you'll be able to find that information the next day if needed, or from a friend if something's breaking. And I know you're a runner, so I would like lean into that, and finding activities that bring you together with like other people, where we can just rest and be and celebrate. Like, that's why like Pride exists. I mean, yes, Pride started off as a riot, but it is a celebration of community and closeness. And that's something to hold dear. Like I just finished reading, you know, one of our mentorship Sangha like challenges for this month was to read like fiction featuring queer folks or by queer folks. And I was just reading this like lovely young adult series, like definitely intended for high school students, but me in my 30s was just like soaking it all up. And it was like fantasy, and like character had two moms and she was also queer, like, and it was just delightful. Like, so soak up the media, the inputs that like make you feel seen too. Oh, I'm going to read some of the things in the chat as well. Queer joy. Yes. Paying attention to narratives that aren't just fatiguing. Yes. Queer folks smile, create, celebrate too. I love going to find art exhibits and things in my area or even online that remind me that we're like the capacity we have, and that there's like such beautiful creativity in the different identities and intersections of identity we have. Juicy, tough question. So Shruti, as you embark on your journey of self-care and addressing this fatigue, if you find anything along the way, that would be really awesome. Send it my way. I also welcome those suggestions. That is a great question. What is something that's like tactile, tangible that we could do right now? Low-hanging fruit, so to speak. I think about like how one introduces oneself is an easy one. Maybe your email signature is another one, if you feel comfortable adding your pronouns in there, particularly in I work in higher education. So it's like, I feel like it's important for me to signal that I'm a person people can be open with through that. Yes, I love this one. I follow queer content creators on social media to understand new perspectives. I sometimes do an audit of like who I'm following on Instagram or on Twitter, like every once in a while, to just see like, am I introducing myself to a variety of different perspectives? And it's not that hard to find queer content creators. Like, we're out there on every single platform. So you just have to find and follow. And you don't even have to like things. You don't have to comment on things. Sometimes just by osmosis and being exposed to a variety of perspectives and different bodies and voices and conversations, like it really opens something up. I'm a podcast girly myself, so I love listening to interviews with queer artists, authors, things like that. Like that's something that feels like a way that I can quote unquote educate myself while on the go. And yes, I'm saying this as a queer person because there's also so many different intersections of identity that I'm less experienced with, or I'm still growing my knowledge around, and I want to be mindful as a future clinician. And yes, Shruti is suggesting that local bookstores often have sections dedicated to queer voices. So that's also a great option. So a couple things: finding those queer content creators on social media to follow, thinking about how you operate in educational environments. So like how you signal in introductions or even in email signatures, like what businesses you frequent. That is also a really good one. Like recently in the Boston area, a coffee shop opened, and then people found out it had connections to an anti-LGBTQ organization, actually. And so there were protests. So I was like, oh, that's a place where I don't want to spend my money. And then I went to the other queer Arab-owned coffee shop that's in a different part of town. I was like, this is where I do want to spend my money. So just with a tiny bit of Googling, we can like find a little more extra information that allows us to make sensible decisions. Oh, Pooja, I love this one. Small tweaks to language. For example, saying, hey, you guys. Yeah, that's very gender. Folks, y'all is the best non-gendered plural. I was like multiple plural word to use. Anjali is sharing, having discussions in the workplaces about our organization's interaction or support of the queer community, or seeking out or starting engagement in DEI. Yeah, these are all baby beautiful steps that you could start tomorrow. Maybe not all at once, but like pick a couple of things and maybe hold yourself accountable to like, these are the 2 things I'm going to try in the next 2 weeks. These are the couple of things I want to explore in the next 2 months. And then these are a couple of things I'm going to try in the next half year. These are really amazing questions. And again, I like really appreciate all of you who have shared your experiences, whether out loud or in the chat or in the small groups too. I know a lot of you are very caring and have such distinct life experiences and expertise that I know every person in the small group with you probably learned from. I feel really grateful. I'm just really grateful to all y'all.
Oh,